You're watching Capital City Sunday.
Former President Donald Trump is coming to Wisconsin the day of our state's presidential primary. He's holding a rally in Green Bay on Tuesday. Trump has already won the delegates needed to lock up the Republican nomination, and he's expected to win Wisconsin's GOP primary as well. In a response to Trump's trip to Wisconsin, President Joe Biden's campaign said, quote, "After many visits to Wisconsin from President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democratic leaders, Donald Trump finally decided to make time to visit our state in between his busy schedule of hiding out in his country club, calling for cuts to Social Security, and calling into white supremacist radio shows to spew anti-Semitism. This November," the campaign said, "Wisconsin will send him packing just like we did in 2020.
Joining me now is New York Times columnist, podcast host, and author Ezra Klein. He's set to give a talk at the Follette School of Public Affairs in Madison in just a couple of weeks. He'll discuss his book, Why We're Polarized, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Ezra, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So to start out, you explored polarization as it relates to American politics, and a big theme in your book is identity, our identities. So how did you find that sense of identity played into the increasing polarization in politics in our country?
I don't think you can see the modern era without seeing it as actually a breakdown in the dominance of one identity. So you have political situations like ours, a sort of rise of right populism, of a kind of ethno-nationalism, not when identity politics becomes stronger, but paradoxically when it becomes weaker. For most of American history, there was an identity that had a kind of consistent hammerlock on political power, white, male, Christian. That created a lot of bad outcomes. It also created a kind of stability and conciliatory nature within the political system. You had people who were like each other, dealing with each other. They had disagreements, right? And you can obviously go back to periods like the Civil War for profound disagreements. But there was an identity that had dominance. As that began to break down, because the demographics of America changed, right? You have the first Black president, you have the sort of coming of a potentially majority-minority nation racially. You also have the coming of a nation where Protestants don't have as much power. I think religious identity is very underplayed in its role in our politics right now. But as you have a more sort of pluralistic competition between the identities, some identities become much more visible. This thing, identity politics, becomes something that we talk about all the time, not because identity became stronger, but again, because it became weaker and more identities can now contest for power and put their claims and needs into political circulation.
So your book was published in 2020, and now 4 years later, how have you seen the landscape change in terms of this polarization and political identity?
Well, when you talk about polarization, you always have to ask, polarization over what? And at different points in American politics, the cleavages that seem to dominate American politics change. So during much of the period in which I was researching and thinking about the book, you were talking about the sort of Republican Party of Paul Ryan, of Mitt Romney, of John McCain. And that was a important political party, right? It was powerful, but the divisions that seemed to be deepest in America were over whether we should pass Obamacare, whether we would privatize Medicare. And now you could say those were driven by identity. I think you would largely be right, but they were being harnessed. They were being maybe sanitized by the political system into being about these sort of core economic issues.